Intelligence leaks to the media recently prompted a flurry of questioning and concern about the integrity of Canadian elections. Hearings are underway in Ottawa, and the Commissioner of Canada Elections last week launched a review of the 2021 campaign. Much of the discussion focuses on China, but the allegations also include several other countries. With us to explain, let's welcome in the nation's capital, Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. And Tonda, it's great to have you back on our airwaves. How are you doing tonight?
Hi, Steve. Good, thanks.
Excellent. Could you give us a quick recap on the main findings of the so-called Rosenberg report? Let's start there.
Okay. Well, look, Morris Rosenberg, a former senior public servant, did a review of the work of the Canada elections, the fairness integrity system, the panel that oversees our elections and attempts to sort of make sure things are being free and fair and everything's above board. And he found that the panel did determine there was attempts at foreign influence, that there was attempts to interfere with the result in some, the outcome in some ridings. But that panel, not Mr. Rosenberg, initially concluded that it didn't affect the outcome of the election. He agreed with that conclusion. So just to bring your viewers up to speed, he himself didn't do the deep dive in the election. It was the panel that did in 2021 during the election campaign. And he agreed with their conclusion, said it was reasonable. And he agreed with, by the way, something that the NDP and the Conservatives have also publicly said, at least, that the outcome of the election was free and fair. So that's where we're at. But what he did do is he found a bunch of shortcomings in the early warning system, and he's made a bunch of recommendations for changes to address some of the problems.
Now, before we go to those, I know that I've spoken to people who said there were attempts by foreigners to insinuate themselves in our election system. You know, this just in, and the suggestion seemed to be that happens all the time, from time immemorial, in countries, mostly democracies, all over the world. So is it fair to respond to this by saying this shouldn't come as big news to anybody?
Well, look, I think it's fair to say it's been an ongoing problem, a long time problem. I think all the political parties are aware of sometimes the work going on to influence certain expat communities in Canada. But I think what's different this time around is that we've seen a bunch of leaks about very specific information. And those leaks themselves that have painted a more specific picture that has troubled a lot of Canadians. And the government is trying to address that and saying, they won't confirm the details of it. But sure, we've heard about attempts to influence, but we hadn't heard before about the attempts, so-called alleged attempts to bus in a bunch of seniors or international students to affect the outcome, say, of a nomination of a particular candidate. Now, what we've learned through this last couple of weeks of both leaks and parliamentary committee and examinations of the issue is that there's a lot of skepticism around that information and contained in those leaks. And there's officially, you know, while they've come as close as they can to denying it, but we've heard the intelligence officials say, you know, they don't have that information. That evidence wasn't put to them. Intelligence is not truth. It is allegations, and everything has to be put in perspective. So look, yes, it's been going on, but I think what we've also seen since, let's say, the 2016 US election is an awareness in all democracies that there's a ramp up, right? There's a ramp up around the world of efforts by authoritarian countries and also some democracies, but a ramp up of efforts by China or by Russia and by many accounts also India to have an influence on the outcome of democratic debate in those countries. And the US election was a big red flag to the Canadian lawmakers and intelligence agencies. And even by their own accounts, it's been a surge in that kind of activity.
Okay, lots to unpack there, which we will do. But just before we do, I think we need a second word on Mr. Rosenberg, Morris Rosenberg, who was the guy at the head of this look-see. And I guess some people have made the point that he has, well, I'll let you qualify it, but some kind of association with the current Prime Minister of Canada, and therefore some questions have arisen as to whether or not he could really provide a free and fair and frank assessment of things. Maybe you could tell us about whatever entanglement there may or may not be, and whether you think it's prejudiced the outcome of what he's found.
Okay, well, let's just start with, first of all, who he is. He's a retired deputy minister who held several of the top portfolios in government. He was at Justice, at Health, and at Foreign Affairs under both Liberal and Conservative prime ministers. Most recently, Stephen Harper. So he was a very top aide in the public service under Chrétien, Paul Martin, and Stephen Harper. And when he retired, he became the head of what's called the Trudeau Foundation. It's a nonprofit charity organization that promotes scholarship and academic discussion of policies. It's in the name of Pierre Trudeau. And because of that work, the Conservatives have used his association with that foundation to attempt to discredit both him and the findings of his report. They are calling for a public inquiry into the allegations, and they're using this link. But look, I think by many accounts, and many conservatives as well have spoken up and defended Mr. Rosenberg and said, they weren't quibbling with him and his work, that they think that some of that is noise. I would say that in a way it is noise, because actually the Rosenberg report, far from kind of completely vindicating everything the government has done, has raised some red flags around, should there be tougher protections around the election system? Should there be the ability to alert the public earlier in the game? What if there's only attempts to influence one candidate in one riding? Shouldn't that be publicly alerted, instead of people saying, oh, well, it didn't affect the whole outcome of the whole election, therefore nobody needs to know? So look, Rosenberg did a lot of hard, I think his recommendations could be described as, tough and critical of the government. They didn't completely whitewash what was going on. He did take, I think, a critical look and made some really good recommendations for reforms.
Okay, let's look at the countries involved here. There have been suggestions that the United States has been involved, India, Saudi Arabia, but of course, most of the attention nowadays is on China. Tell us why.
Well, China seems to have the Chinese government. Let's be very clear: it's the Communist Party rulers, and under a ruler who's become more authoritarian as years go on, Xi Jinping, have seemingly got a more organized network of efforts abroad, both internationally in Australia, in the U.S., all over, really, to attempt to shape public opinion about their own government and about the policies that governments like the Canadian government adopt in the face of China. And so we're hearing a lot about China because there's a lot of allegations that it uses the expat community either by using sympathizers with the communist rulers or by coercing expat Chinese Canadians to try and produce an outcome they want. So I think that the difference is it seems like a more broad-based and coordinated effort. We've heard news in the past year of these so-called Chinese police stations, which China claimed that were operating in Canada, which China claimed were there to really facilitate visas and whatnot for Chinese Canadians and people dealing with, attempts to go back or deal with family. And in fact, look, that kind of raised a lot of alarms, and the RCMP has now said that they, being concerned about the operations of that and whether or not it went beyond the bounds of typical diplomatic activity, stationed, uniform marked cars outside those so-called police stations, and they've all shut down now. It's hard to know. It's hard to get at the bottom of it because, look, diplomats around the world, including Canada, do attempt to ensure that their viewpoints are heard in debates. Like Canada did a full court press in the US on both the NAFTA renegotiation and on the Buy American policies. Diplomats do this kind of thing. The question is, are they overstepping their bounds and trying to influence an outcome, trying to change the result of nomination meetings, trying to change the actual result of an election? And that's the big worrying thing. And I think that's where we've heard a lot about China. And again, it goes back to the specifics that were leaked. That's worrying. The other countries involved, we've heard that the Conservatives specifically were warned about not just China, but India, Russia, South Africa, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and their attempts to influence the elections debate in Canada. Those are pretty serious allegations. We haven't heard much talk about those other countries because, by all accounts, China, Russia, and Iran are the big offenders.
Well, you used an expression in that last answer that I think we need to probe a little more deeply, and that is, quote unquote, the outcome they want. Do we in fact know what the outcome is that China wanted in the last federal election in this country?
Well, there are allegations and reports that they wanted, I believe the Globe and Mail has reported specifically that the Chinese Communist Party was attempting to ensure that the Liberals won, but only a minority government. I mean, that's a pretty specific allegation. We haven't seen a lot to back that up. There are a lot of party operatives who say, well, good luck with trying to actually engineer that outcome. They themselves try to engineer outcomes that don't always occur during election campaigns. But that specifically is one, I think, accusation that has emerged and has given a lot of the parties in the House of Commons pause. To expect that there was a coordinated plan, or to think that there was a coordinated plan, that raises a bunch of questions. What is our system adequately resourced to monitor all the social media that these governments might use to influence debate here, and all the other machinations they might use? I think that's a big question now.
And can we understand why the Chinese Communist Party would want a liberal federal government, but on a leash, so that they only had a minority government? Why would they want something that specific to emerge?
Well, their view, as promoted on social media during the election campaign of 2021, was certainly that the Conservatives would take a more hardline approach to China. And we have seen in the last few parliaments, actually, the Conservatives have been very hawkish on China. Let's also put some context around this. During the campaign of 2021, the federal campaign, it was a time when by then already 2 Canadians had been in detention in Beijing for a couple of years after the Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, had been arrested in Canada at the request of the US. And tensions between Canada, the Canadian government, and the Chinese government were at a complete low. I mean, or I guess tensions were at a high, but the relationship was in the deep freeze. And the government was walking on eggshells when it came to every policy decision, the Liberal government, that is, when it came to every policy decision related to China. Shortly after that campaign, due, we know, to the interventions of a bunch of people, the two Michaels, the 2 Canadians, were released days after the election campaign. So I just mentioned that to put some context around what outcome did China want? Well, China didn't want an even a more hawkish Canadian government in Ottawa. That's pretty simple.
Right. And how about all the seats that they are alleged to have tried to have their way in? Did all those seats vote Liberal at the end of the day?
No, and look, I mean, I think it's a very debatable point. Look, China denies, by the way, all of this. China says they never tried to interfere in any elections. They say that slander. They say that they never went beyond any bounds. But in the sort of series of allegations that have emerged in media reports, and actually ever since the 2021 election, we've heard this. There have been both allegations about Conservative and Liberal held ridings. We do know that a few Conservatives lost ridings they weren't expected to lose. Kenny Chiu out west in Steveston, Richmond, and Alice Wong as well. So some ridings did get lost. But look, there's the allegations in the various media reports suggest that China was supporting some Conservative candidates and some Liberal candidates. It's a bit of a potpourri, if you want.
Well, as long as we're on the Conservative side of the ledger here, let's figure out what's going on inside that little political family right now, because this is, in some respects, manna from heaven for an opposition party to really take on the government of the day. And you know, elements in the Conservative Party are doing that. But then I think I noticed in your newspaper yesterday, Fred DeLorey, who's a longtime Conservative backroom guy, runs campaigns, pretty successful, stated quite explicitly in his op-ed piece, this did not, you know, if there was interference, it did not result in the change of the outcome of the election campaign. So can you make sense of all of that for us, please?
Well, yeah, I mean, he was the director of the campaign when Erin O'Toole was a leader. And don't forget, after the 2021 election result, there were some complaints about whether or not there was Chinese social media at play in the debate in certain ridings. But more to the point, Erin O'Toole was squarely blamed for the loss by his entire caucus. And months later, in the heat of the convoy that descended on Ottawa, was turfed from the party. So it was a bit of revisionist sort of analysis going on about that election and what was the cause of the Conservative Party's loss. Back then, by many, many accounts, it was a failed campaign, bad messaging, bad communications, and whatnot. So, and even now, I think we do see there's a disconnect, I see anyway, between the narrative that some MPs, Conservative MPs, are putting forward at the committee examining this issue. Very hardline, we need a public inquiry, and, a suggestion that all these intelligence agencies failed to notify the candidates and notify the parties and notify the Canadian public. But Pierre Poilievre himself is walking a much finer line in public. He is sticking to the point or the line that they believe the outcome was fair. He is calling for a public inquiry, but also saying that, the work, it can't be, someone, a supporter of the Trudeau government leading it. It has to be someone everybody can agree on. But it's a much finer line. He also is aware that he has to appeal to voters in ridings across this country, primarily in the GTA and the Greater Vancouver area, who are of Chinese descent. And it's a tricky one, right? He has to show that he empathizes with some of the concerns in the diaspora community, while also hammering the Trudeau government on its handling of the affair.
All right. In our last 30 seconds then, Tonda, how about this? There's sort of been two main ways people have wanted to get to the bottom of this. The public inquiry you just mentioned, or, as I think Fred Delory mentioned in his piece yesterday, he thinks an all-party parliamentary committee could do just as good a job, more quickly, less expensively, getting to the bottom of whatever they need to get to the bottom of here. Do you have any view as to which way is the better way to go?
Well, look, I don't know that I have a view. I can tell you that from reading the tea leaves of everything that's going on, I think the federal government hasn't landed yet on what is the best way forward. They realize that they've got to address public concerns about elections integrity, and quickly. There is another campaign looming within sometime in the next 2 years. And I think that, the idea that it could go to this parliamentary committee of senators and MPs who are cleared to screen national security information, top secret classified documents, and not reveal, the tradecraft that the spy agency says it used to obtain this information, is perhaps the way much of it will land. I think that, maybe the government will explicitly task that committee. The committee doesn't need the government to task it. It can undertake it on its own. It already did after the 2019 election. Look at this question of foreign interference and issued a report. Very critical also, by the way. The other place where some of this might land is the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. That's a new agency that was created. It expanded the old agency that used to review only CSIS. This interviews the Foreign Signals Intelligence Agency as well. And it's also a very good place for some of this to be examined in private.
Gotcha. Great job, Tonda. Thanks so much for joining us on the air here tonight. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.
That's Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief, Toronto Star.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.